The wind was merciless that evening, carrying with it the taste of sand and the sharp sting of loneliness. On a narrow dirt road, far from the whispers of any town, a woman walked with her daughter. The girl was no more than 7 years old. Her cheeks hollow, her eyes dim, her tiny hand clutching the hem of her mother's torn dress. They had walked for miles without rest, without shelter, without the certainty of a tomorrow. The widow's boots were worn down to the leather, they stitching unraveling with every step. Her face told the story of too many nights under the open sky, and her silence was the silence of someone who had lost more than she could ever speak of. The sun was sinking low when the sound of hooves cut through the heavy quiet. A horse, black, as coal and strong from years of work, appeared over the ridge. On its back sat a rancher, broad-shouldered, dust clinging to his hat, the weight of solitude pressed deep into his eyes. His name was not yet spoken, but everything about him carried the quiet gravity of a man who had lived through storms of his own. He reined in his horse when he saw them. A woman and a child, alone, exhausted, their shadows stretched long across the road. For a moment he said nothing, only studied them with the caution of a man used to a world where trust was dangerous. The woman tightened her grip on her daughter, pulling her close as though the stranger might take her too. But the rancher's eyes softened. He dismounted slowly, raising his hands in the air, showing he carried no threat. "You look like you've been walking a long way," he said, his voice low, worn, like gravel smoothed by years of wind. Widow swallowed. Her lips cracked from thirst. We don't have anywhere left to go." The rancher reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen. He handed it first to the child. The girl hesitated, glancing up at her mother for permission, then drank desperately, water spilling down her chin. When she passed it back, Rancher saw the tears welling in the widow's eyes. "Not many folks pass this way," he said, studying her face. "But you found my road. That makes you my responsibility now." The words lingered in the air, heavy and kind at the same time. He motioned toward his horse. "Come with me. My ranch isn't far. There's food, a fire, and a roof strong enough to keep the night out." The widow hesitated. She had trusted before, and it had cost her everything. But when she looked at her daughter, thin, trembling, too young to carry so much suffering, she knew she couldn't refuse Dot, so she nodded. The rancher lifted the little girl onto the horse, then offered his hand to the widow. For the first time in months, she allowed someone else to carry a piece of her burden. Together, they rode into the dimming horizon, where the first stars of night were beginning to appear, and though no one said it aloud, something had shifted. On that lonely road, 2 broken lives had crossed paths, and neither would ever be the same again. The ranch lay at the edge of the valley, where the land stretched wide and lonely beneath a sky painted in fading blues. The widow and her daughter sat at the wooden table that night, their bellies full for the first time in weeks. The rancher had slaughtered a chicken, baked bread in the fire, and set out beans seasoned with nothing more than salt and survival. The little girl fell, asleep with her head resting on the table before the meal was done, her body too weak to fight against. Rest. The rancher carried her carefully to a small bed near the hearth, covering her with a wool blanket worn from years of use. Then he sat across from the widow, the silence between them heavy, filled with words unspoken. The fire popped, casting shadows across his face. She finally spoke, her voice brittle. "My husband is dead, shot down on the Santa Fe trail. Bandits took everything, and left me and the child with nothing but sorrow." Her eyes dropped to her hands, hands that trembled, as though still carrying the weight of that day. "I thought I could find work, maybe somewhere far enough that the memories wouldn't follow. But the West doesn't offer much kindness to women alone. Everywhere I went, doors closed. The rancher listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening at the mention of bandits. His hand clenched around the mug he held, knuckles white. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weariness of his own ghosts. "My wife," he said slowly, as though each word carried the weight of a stone, "died the night my daughter was born. One moment I was holding her hand, telling her we'd be a family. The next I was holding a newborn child, and her mother was gone." He stared into the flames, his voice steady but hollow. "I buried her with my own hands. Out there, by the cottonwoods." The widow's eyes softened with a pain that mirrored his. For the first time since they had met, she truly looked at him, not just as a stranger offering shelter, but as a man carved by the same cruelty that had carved her. The room was quiet, except for the fire and the soft breathing of the two little girls who now slept side by side. "You've carried sorrow," the widow whispered. "And so have you," the rancher answered. Their eyes met, and though no promises were spoken, something passed between them. It wasn't love yet, nor trust, but it was the faint recognition of two souls who knew the same kind of emptiness. Outside, the night was vast, filled with coyotes howling at the moon. Inside, by the dim glow of firelight, two strangers began to stitch their broken lives together with nothing but silence and the fragile thread of shared grief. The days that followed passed quietly, yet each one wove the widow and her daughter deeper into the fabric of the ranch. The girls played in the tall grass beyond the barn, their laughter rising like birds against the wide-open sky. For the first time in years, the rancher's daughter no longer looked lonely. For the first time since the road, the widow's daughter smiled without fear. The rancher watched from the porch, leaning on the wooden host, the weight in his chest shifting into something he had almost forgotten: hope. He had lived so long in silence that he had begun to believe silence was all the world had left for him. But now, when he came in from the fields, he heard the sounds of life: pots clattering, the crackle of fire, two little girls chasing each other through the house. It felt like a home again. One evening, the widow stood by the corral, brushing the rancher's horse while the sun bled red and gold across the horizon. He stepped toward her, boots crunching softly in the dust. For a moment, he simply watched, as if memorizing the sight of her there, framed by twilight. "You've done more than you know," he said finally, his voice low, steady. She turned to him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "My daughter hasn't laughed like that since her mother passed," he answered. His eyes held hers, clear and unflinching. "You brought light back into her world." The widow lowered her gaze, her hand brushing down the horse's mane. "And you've given mine something I couldn't: a roof, safety, a reason to rest." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. The rancher took a step closer, his hat in his hands now, his voice thick with something deeper than words. "Your daughter needs a home," he said slowly, "and my daughter needs a mother. Maybe God crossed our paths for a reason." The world seemed to still. The horses shifted quietly in the corral. The wind carried the scent of hay, and the widow felt the sting of tears she had fought so hard to hold back. Her lips trembled. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying we could build something new," the rancher whispered. "Two broken families made whole. Not out of pity, not out of charity, but because sometimes the Lord takes what's shattered and gives us the chance to mend it together." The widow pressed her hand against her chest, torn between fear and longing. She had sworn never to open her heart again, never to trust another man with her life or her child. Yet here, under the painted sky, his words sank into the deepest part of her. She looked toward the house, where their daughters laughed inside, their voices spilling out through the open window like music. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a wanderer. She felt like someone who had arrived where she belonged. The rancher extended his hand. Not forceful, not demanding, simply waiting. Her breath shook as she placed her hand in his dot, and though no vows were spoken, and no preacher stood before them, something holy happened in that moment. A promise, quiet and unbreakable, sealed not by rings but by the shared wounds of the past and the fragile hope of tomorrow. Dawn broke over the valley with a softness the widow had almost forgotten existed. Golden light spilled across the ranch, painting the fields in warmth, pushing away the long shadows of yesterday. The smell of bread drifted from the kitchen. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the walls, and for the first time in years, the house felt alive. The rancher saddled his horse in the quiet of morning, the leather creaking, the animals stirring in the barn. He paused when he heard footsteps behind him. The widow stood there, hair loose in the breeze, her daughter holding her hand. She smiled, not the tired, hollow smile she had worn when they first met, but something real, something that belonged to a woman who had finally found solid ground. "You were right," she said softly. "Maybe God did cross our paths for a reason." The rancher lowered his head, tipping his hat, but when his eyes lifted to meet hers, there was no doubt left in them. He stepped forward and placed his hand gently on her daughter's shoulder, steady and sure. Then he looked at the widow, his voice firm yet tender. "This house is yours now. This land, this fire, this table, not just a shelter, but a home. For both of you." The widow's daughter looked up at him, her small face breaking into a smile as bright as the morning itself. She ran toward the rancher's own little girl, and together they sprinted into the fields, their laughter carrying on the wind. For a moment, it was as though the valley itself had been waiting for that sound. The widow stood close now, her hand brushing against his. A silence between them was no longer heavy, but light, filled with a quiet peace. She whispered, almost to herself, "I thought I had lost everything, but maybe I was only being led here." The rancher turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun climbed higher. "Out here," he said, his voice steady, "loss is a language we all speak, but sometimes it's also where we find the pieces of what comes next." She leaned against him, resting her head near his shoulder. No vows, no grand ceremony, no gathering of witnesses, only the land, the sky, the sound of their daughters, and the quiet certainty of two lives that had chosen to walk forward together. Dot, and so the ranch, once a place of silence and grief, became something else entirely. A haven, a promise, a new beginning carved out of the dust and the sorrow of the Wild West. The narrator's voice closes the tale. In a land where death was common and hope was rare, two broken souls found one, another, and though the world had taken much from them, together they built something the West could not steal. A family.